morning, grade 9s, and welcome to your next online history lesson. Today's lesson is a continuation of the previous lesson in the sense that we're going to continue looking at the increasing tension between the Allies after the end of World War II in Europe. As discussed in the previous lesson, I explained to you that the problem was the ideological differences between the Allies. Russia was a communist state and the rest of the Allies were all capitalist states. So in terms of what we also discussed in the previous lesson, we looked at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, where the Allies decided what they were going to do with Germany once they had defeated Germany, and we had a look at how they divided Germany into East Germany, which was communist, and West Germany, which was capitalist, and how they also divided the capital Berlin into East Berlin, which fell under communist rule, and West Berlin, which fell under capitalist rule. We then moved on to the defeat of Germany by May of 1945, and today's lesson is going to have a look at another wartime conference later on in that year. So the second wartime conference in 1945 was the Potsdam Conference, the name obviously coming from the place where it was held, Potsdam. The participants at this conference were exactly the same participants at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. And the reason why they gathered this time, or met this time, was to decide how to administer punishment to the defeated Nazi Germany. So initially in February, they were thinking about what they were going to do. And by July, after Germany's defeat, they decided how they were going to basically go about this. So although the Soviet Union, Britain and the USA as countries send representatives to the Potsdam Conference, there's a change in terms of who is sent. What I mean by that is who the new leaders are. So Joseph Stalin remains. He is still the Communist Party General Secretary of the Soviet Union. However, in terms of Britain, we've got a slight change. Winston Churchill initially attends the conference, and then later on Clement Attlee attends, as Attlee basically wins the elections in Britain and Churchill is replaced. With regards to America, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sadly passes away, and he is replaced by Harry S. Truman. So by the time this conference takes place in July of 1945, we see that there is basically tension between the Allies. Reason being is that Churchill is no longer there, and he actually had time for Joseph Stalin. Clement Attlee had no time for Stalin. Secondly, Truman, also similarly to Attlee, has no time for Stalin. However, as we know previously, Roosevelt did have a lot of time for Stalin. So because of the new role players that are now attending this conference, we see increasing tension. So I'm going to explain what is happening on this slide by having a look at the map on the next slide. It's just easier if we look at the map in terms of explaining what was going on in Europe at this particular point in time. So if you have a look at the map of Europe in front of you, you need to understand that during the Second World War, there were Allied troops from Russia, Britain, France, the USA, throughout Europe, trying to defeat obviously the Germans and the Italians. Once Germany was defeated, what happened is that the Russians, who were mostly on the eastern side of Europe, because Russia is on the eastern side of Europe, refused to withdraw. And this is what basically caused the tension at the Potsdam Conference, because the rest of the Allies were asking Joseph Stalin to withdraw his troops from Eastern Europe, and he was saying he was not going to withdraw his troops from Eastern Europe because he was scared of a possible third attack by Germany. You can understand Stalin's argument because he had lived through World War I as well as World War II, and in both instances Germany had moved east first and obviously tried to attack the USSR. So his argument was that he was keeping troops in Eastern Europe basically to protect his country. The other allies, when I say the other allies, Britain, France, and the USA, basically did not believe him. They felt that he was basically trying to gain additional territory by annexing these countries or taking over these countries. And this is what led ultimately to the divide between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. If you recall from the previous lesson that I gave you, I said that an Iron Curtain basically divided Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So the eastern side of Europe eventually fell under communist control and the western side of Europe fell under capitalist control. As mentioned earlier at the beginning of the lesson, during the conference, this is now the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, Churchill's party is defeated in Britain and Clement Attlee becomes the Prime Minister, and as I also said, he did not trust Stalin. Roosevelt, as I also mentioned, died just before the end of World War II. As I also said, Harry Truman becomes the president. Roosevelt had a good relationship with Stalin. I'm not sure if you guys can all recall the photograph that I showed you in the previous lesson where they all looked quite happy sitting next to each other at the Yalta conference. However, Truman was very suspicious of Stalin and similarly, like I also said, to Attlee, did not trust him. You need to understand that while the Potsdam Conference was taking place, the war in the Pacific was still continuing, mostly between the Americans and the Japanese. So on the 16th of July 1945, the Americans successfully test an atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert in the USA. And Churchill and Truman agree that the weapon should be used to defeat Japan because Japan is giving no indication of surrendering. The problem is that Truman did not tell Stalin about the atomic bomb until the 25th of July 1945. And this made Stalin very unhappy because you need to understand he had been fighting with the Allies for 6 years in the war against the Germans and then obviously against the Japanese and the Italians, and he felt betrayed to a large extent that the Americans did not trust him with the information that they had now successfully built an atomic bomb. However, Stalin was nobody's fool, and he already knew about the atomic bomb as he had KGB spies that had infiltrated the group that was working on the bomb, and they'd obviously told him about what America had been up to. By the 26th of July, the Potsdam Declaration had been broadcast to Japan, and they threatened a total destruction of the Japanese mainland unless Japan's government surrendered. So grade 9s, that's the end of today's lesson. There are a number of questions in terms of your homework activity for today, which I'd like you to please complete by Wednesday, so that you're up to date before you receive your next lesson on Thursday. So quickly, just to run through the different questions, it's activity 1 on page 140. Question 1, at which conference was it decided to divide Germany between the Allies? Question number 2, use source B to explain how Germany was divided up at the end of World War II. Question number 3, list 4 things that caused tension between the Allies at the Potsdam Conference. Question number 4, why do you think Stalin had a good reason to distrust America and Britain during this conference? Question 5, why do you think Attlee and Truman distrusted Stalin at this conference? Question 6, what do you notice about the relationship between the 3 people in the photograph in source C? Please refer to visual clues, for instance, body language. Are they smiling? Aren't they smiling? Those kind of visual clues. Question 7, what do you notice about the relationship between the 3 people in the photograph in source D? Once again, visual clues, grade 9s. And then the last 2 questions, what difference do you notice in the body language of the 3 people sitting in the photograph in source C and source D? And the last question, explain why the body language of the 3 leaders is so different in the 2 photographs. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and good luck with the activity.